Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. Israel has two major maritime fronts as well as secondary ones such as the Sea of Galilee, which used to border Syria, and the Dead Sea, which Israel shares with the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. However, the two main bodies of water of concern to Israel, of course, are the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, and its southern approaches all the way to Bab-el-Mandeb and beyond. To analyze the naval defenses in these two theaters, including vis-a-vis the protection of coastal population centers and infrastructure assets, alongside shipping and economic targets, we're joined from Central Israel by Colonel Dr. Eran Lerman, who is co-host of TV7 Middle East Review, Vice President of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security, and a lecturer at Shalem College in Jerusalem. Thank you for joining us, sir.
And now the editor of the Jerusalem Strategic Tribune. Thank you.
Correct indeed. And also joining us from the northern part of Israel is Rear Admiral Professor Shaul Chorev, who is the head of Maritime Policy and Strategy Research Center at the University of Haifa. Thank you for joining us as well, sir.
You're welcome.
And I'd like also to welcome our TV7 analyst and host of TV7's Watchmen Talk, Mr. Amir Oren. Amir, give us a broader understanding on this theater that has been away from the lens of international media, but at the same time has been also a concentrated interest of everyone, considering the so-called shadow wars between Israel and Iran that we hear so much about, the attack by the Islamic Republic per an investigation that was conclusive by CENTCOM, the Central Command of the U.S. Armed Forces, with regard to the UAV attack on the Mercer Street, and so much more that occurred over the strategic waterways that impact each and every one of us around the world. What can you tell us about that?
So, you know, Jonathan, in coastal states and empires, the Navy is usually the senior service. Not so in Israel, even though the coast was exposed from 1948 on, even though we all remember the thousands of Jews who came via the sea in the 1940s, during and after World War II, even though the navies of Egypt and Syria were of concern to the Israeli Defense Forces in several wars. But nevertheless, because of the success of the Israeli forces altogether, Navy, Air Force, Army, to repel any invaders or deter any attack on the coast, as well as on shipping, some people in Israel have neglected this front, and Admiral Chorev is remarkably one of those who has researched, written, and brought to the attention of decision makers as well as the general public the importance of the maritime domain. Now, you referred to both the defense and economic aspects of this front, this problem. And yes, Iran, both as an offensive power as well as a transshipper of weapons and other machinery to Hezbollah, to Hamas, and to other groups, is now one of the targets for the Israeli Navy, especially perhaps the naval commandos, or perhaps the submarines. We don't know. It all happens underwater. And because the Israeli economic expansion in and under the sea regarding gas exploration is so much a central part now of the Israeli economy, this is also of concern regarding protection of these targets from the Iranians, from Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and all the rest.
Indeed, and as such, Israel has also been bolstering its ranks. Dr. Lerman, I'd like to ask you, just recently, Israel has received yet another Sal 6 class frigate that is created in Germany and then brought here to Israel to be interoperable with the various components of the Israeli Navy. What can you tell us about the strengthening of the Israeli Navy, considering that it's very small, but very technological at the same time and capable to establish plenty of deterrence on the one hand, but at the same time, we see the Iranians not really being wary by that deterrence, even when we're talking about the American Navy, for that matter.
The Israeli Navy, first of all, has three missions nowadays. In addition to its traditional role in protecting our sea lanes of communications, it is also part of our broader deterrent posture, and the less I would say about this, the better. And also, it is now in charge of defending our EEZ, our economic zone, exclusive economic zone, which includes large areas of the Eastern Mediterranean where we have strategic economic interests, in conjunction with our partners. In Greece, Cyprus, Egypt, we have an interest in the defense of the Eastern Mediterranean and stability in the Eastern Mediterranean. So all of this, and the frigates from Germany are actually part of the Eastern Mediterranean, the EEZ protection capacity that Israel is now obliged to build up. So leaving aside certain shadows as to the circumstances of some of these agreements, the need is real, and the challenge is becoming much more acute. And I was saying also that I would say that the Iranian bluster should not, vis-a-vis the Americans and Israel, should not be read as policy. There's quite a lot of bravado, and then they go out and basically farm out their most dirty missions to their proxies in order not to be implicated. So their caution is still there, and we should take this also into account.
Indeed. Admiral Chorev, of course, as a former commander of the Israeli submarine fleet, and much more in your long list of positions, you have quite the unique outlook at the situation throughout the Mediterranean. Of course, we're talking also about the Red Sea and beyond that. How do you see Israel's current standing with regard to the threats that may emanate from multiple sources that seek to harm the Jewish state, but also on a wider term with cooperation with strategic allies in the region?
It's a very good question, because you mentioned maritime domain awareness, and I think that we in Israel are suffering from maritime domain blindness. When we speak about maritime security, it's not only the Navy power or the naval power of the Israeli Navy. And we are speaking about missions like what the EEZ, giving the security to the infrastructure of the EEZ, it requires from us to do it as a constabulary. It's not a pure military mission, it's a constabulary. In other nations, Coast Guard can do such things. Another issue, and you mentioned, is after the retreat from the Sinai Peninsula, I think that the sea is the only domain that gives us the strategic depth. And I think that cleverly, Israel should use this strategic depth that the sea is giving to Israel, with all its infrastructure, as well with some of its submarines and other ingredients. One element that I think that the importance is increasing is the Red Sea. When I served in the Red Sea during '77, we had the mission to secure the line of communication, but especially from the oil that come from Iran. And I think that everybody remembered the 1971 attack on one of our tankers, and it was the decision to deploy from Sharm el-Sheikh the missile to protect these lines of communication. Currently, I think that more than 25% of Israeli import-export is going through the Red Sea. And I think that that's one of the missions of the Israeli Navy, to secure this line of communication. So there are multiple missions that the Israeli Navy should apply in these areas. And beside what Eran mentioned, I think that whenever we are speaking about what we assign to the Israeli Navy is what is our strategic objectives. I think that there is no question about the infiltration or proliferation of weapons that are going through the Red Sea, and I think the Israeli Navy demonstrated in the 2000s and later that we should stop and in the very beginning sort of proliferation of weapons. But the question currently is, what is the objective of the covert warfare that we have opened, according to the sources, in this arena, and is it serving our objectives concerning Iran?
Mr. Oren, this is actually very interesting, speaking about the depth of field, about the Sinai Peninsula that was implemented at the time by General and later Minister Chaim Bar-Lev, something that needed to be heavily invested in, and however, the Israeli government only provided some 10% to the budgetary defenses of the Sinai Peninsula that costed later dearly during the Egyptian offensive at the time. But right now, when we're looking at the strategic depth of the maritime domain, what is the political perspective to this matter?
Well, when you use the term political, of course, it has a double meaning in domestic Israeli politics as well as diplomatic international relations. And curiously enough, and this goes back to the late 1940s, early 1950s, at the time, the maritime domain, the port of Haifa, which was basically the only one. Of course, there was also Jaffa and Tel Aviv, later Ashdod, but the port of Haifa, the Longshoremen Union, the Seafarers Union, there were shipping companies like Tzim and others. Several ships went around the seven seas flying the Israeli flag. One of the parties, Achdut HaAvodah, held the Ministry of Transportation, and because of that, the ruling party, Mapai, tried to cultivate the aviation sector, including the Israel aviation industry, and it controlled El Al and other such sectors. Now, because of the success of Israel in deterring most attacks, except perhaps in 1956, the Egyptian frigate or destroyer escort Ibrahim El Awel, which was captured, basically all of the Israeli population living along the coast from Haifa to Tel Aviv, north of that, south of that, felt quite secure, even while there were air raids because of Egyptian bombers. No ships bombarded the coast. Some people in Israel grew complacent about it. And only when gas exploration came into or under the scene some 12, 15 years ago, did Israelis open their eyes to the potential as well as the problem of this domain. And as Shaul Chorev mentioned, even now, even in the age of airlifters, of flights around the world, not only by commercial airliners, but by DHL or FedEx or others, which are exclusively cargo. Even then, most of the shipping, most of the foodstuff, most of the petroleum is going to come to Israel by sea. And therefore, Israel should invest more in protecting this crucial infrastructure.
Indeed. Dr. Lerman, I'd like to hear your perspective on this and actually highlight one incident that was attributed to the Israeli Navy with regard to the Saviz, an Iranian so-called tanker, but actually what it served to be was intelligence headquarters for the RGC Navy in the Red Sea in a strategic waterway that, of course, granted it strategic capacity vis-a-vis also Saudi Arabia, also Yemen, but also elsewhere with regard to the shipping or maritime routes where Israeli ships are also being transported through. And even though this specific target was incapacitated and later towed away from there, intelligence reports are speaking about Beshad being another vessel right now that just took its place and continues to conduct the same operations which the Savis did before that, which raises my question specifically to this instant. Is Israel able to contend with Iranian determination, other determinations in the region, lacking what it seems to be some sort of deterrence to just continuing its malign activities in the region by employing and deploying additional maritime forces in that theater, which is so strategic not only for Israel, but for the entire world?
Well, first of all, when it comes to Israeli military operations that are not acknowledged, I've made it a rule for myself to abide by three principles. One is not to talk about things I don't know about. The second is not to talk about things I know about. And the third is never to let you know whether I know or do not know about it. So I'm not going to go into any specific detail.
And now to what you allegedly predict.
We do have something broad going on, which is acknowledged, called the CBW by its English initials in Hebrew that goes under Mabam and Ma'acha Ben HaMelchamot, campaign between the wars, which is designed to deny Iran the capacity to turn Syria and into a deployed field against us, and to also prevent Lebanon from being, or Hezbollah in Lebanon from being provided with the cutting edge of Iranian technology. And beyond that, we have an ongoing confrontation going back all the way to the Karine and other incidents against Iranian attempts to influence the balance of power in the region, whether directly or through its proxies. And what we have going for us, and this I can say again in a very generalized way, but with certainty, we have a much better intelligence dominance than the Iranians in these matters, and we have a very, very long arm operationally. Some of the acknowledged operations going back years, like the Karine, were carried out deep into the higher, on the high seas, not anywhere near our actual waters. And I think that the intelligence capacity that backs this kind of operations is there and will be there based on what we have and based on a robust relationship with some of our friends. So I think the Iranians are at a disadvantage in this respect, and they are aware of it. So from time to time they let loose at an Israeli-owned easy mark, easy target in the Gulf. But have they ever tried to confront proper Israeli assets on the high seas? That hasn't happened, and there are reasons why this hasn't happened.
With that being said, and I'd like to refer this question to you, Admiral Chorev, when we're looking at the maritime theater, there are many easy targets, if you will, that roam around the Persian Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz, and elsewhere, especially now that relations have been established with the United Arab Emirates, with Bahrain, all of which have become key ports for Israeli trade and commercial assets in the offshore area. How do you see this actually challenge Israeli capacity to protect its assets, which are still very significant with regard to what ultimately implicates or impacts the ordinary citizen in Israel?
I agree with Iran when it's come to prevent a proliferation of weapons. And there is no question about such an example of the Korean A. The question that I think that we have to deal with it is when you are coming to a covert warfare, and especially when you think that it serves your mission to prevent Iran to achieve a nuclear weapon, and you think that damaging Iran, let's say, oil export is doing such a thing, you have to think what is the strategic measure of effectiveness that you can measure. And I think that you touch a very good point. Currently, Israel has no, let's say, national commerce fleet. Nothing. It was not like the 70s and 80s. And if you are speaking about 6,400 ships that are entering Israel ports, only 4% of them are owned by Israeli owners. So when we see that ships that belong to company owners in Israel, I think that the Iranians know what they are doing. Another aspect is that the Israeli Navy cannot operate in the Gulf of Oman, in the Arabic Sea. It's out of its operational capabilities. So once you start to deal with such an issue, you have to think what will be the reaction, and if it were such a thing. And the last one is, if you don't have such a capability, let's try to cooperate with other navies. I think that once Israel is part of the Central Command, and the Central Command has the Fifth Fleet, it will be very good to coordinate, to cooperate with the Fifth Fleet. I think that in the past, we have a very good experience with the Sixth Fleet that was part of the theater missile defense, and with regard to the trade that we will have to protect in areas that is out of the Israeli Navy capabilities, we will have to try and to see how we cooperate with our allies, namely the Fifth Fleet and other navies in this region, because, as I mentioned, our trade with the Far East becoming a very the lion's share of the Israeli commerce.
Indeed, and just to clarify, if you will, would you suggest Israel send one of its newly acquired frigates to complete some sort of strike group, which is part of the Fifth Fleet currently in the Persian Gulf?
Not necessarily, but it can do such a thing. But there are, let's say, international group operating under the resolution of the Security Council that are many navies operating, number 150. It might be. You know that today showing the flag is one of the mission of the Navy. So as you mentioned, if Israeli Navy ship, SAR 6, SAR 5, will enter a port in the Red Sea, for instance, port of Sudan, for instance, in Oman, it might demonstrate also the cooperation and the coordination that we might have with a friendly navy that are taking care of such mission in these areas.
Indeed. Mr. Oren?
Admiral Chorev chose to speak as Professor Chorev, as if it's a theoretical matter, but he knows full well that the new leader of the Fifth Fleet was here quite recently as the guest of the Israel Navy. He actually came from Egypt. And because Egypt, too, is part of CENTCOM, even though it's in North Africa, it's not part of AFRICOM.
Which just did also a joint maneuver with the Fifth Fleet and other assets
right.
of the American
And,
Navy.
of course, the Suez Canal is the waterway linking the Mediterranean and these southernmost seas. So, yes, there is some new cooperation between the Israeli Navy and the Fifth Fleet, as well as with CENTCOM in general, because, of course, the air cover is being given by the Israeli Air Force. Our aircraft carriers are not yet here. They're still being built somewhere.
Or aircraft carriers are onshore rather than offshore.
That's right, Israel itself. So yes, there is a new cooperation and an intimate relationship between Israel, including the Navy, and the United States and several other allies.
Indeed. Dr. Lerman, last sentence. What should Israel focus on in the near future when we're talking about the maritime domain?
Deterring the Iranians, foiling their bid to give Hezbollah the necessary cards for dominance in Lebanon, and work with our allies in the Eastern Mediterranean to stabilize the region so that there can be a balanced, I would say, negotiation about the future of the region with our Turkish, let's say, frenemies in the Eastern Mediterranean.
Indeed. Admiral Chorev, closing sentence from you. What should we focus on from your perspective?
I think that there is understand what does it mean maritime security. And to add what Colonel Lerman mentioned, I think that there are other dimensions. When we are speaking about the infrastructure, it's not only the gas. We have the desalination water, 60% of Israel. We have to take out of the Israeli dense shores some of the infrastructure, power station, others into the sea. We have to understand what is the equilibrium that can we achieve in the Eastern Mediterranean, because
Indeed.
Turkey, one side, Greece, Cyprus in the other side, and it is a very delicate situation to operate there.
Indeed. We'll have to revisit this topic, of course, in the near future. The East Med is part of our keen observation of this region, which has significance also for the security of the State of Israel. I'd like to thank Colonel Dr. Eran Lerman, Rear Admiral Professor Chorev, and Mr. Oren for being part of today's panel. And I'd like to thank our viewers as well. And we will see you next time.